Good morning, everyone. As Sue said, my name is Jory Burson, and I am the Chief Operating Officer of Boku. That's, I think, probably the best job in the whole wide world. Second to maybe Open Web Engineer at Boku. And that's only because maybe don't know exactly what a COO does. And practically speaking, it means I do really important things like approve Boku's sticker budget, laugh at Adam Sontag's puns, I pick up after Rick's robots, as I did yesterday, and go to really important business meetings like that of the Boku Diorama Club. It also means that I run an open source software company, which entails thinking a lot about how to operate Boku so that it operates in service of our mission, which is to move the open web forward. That's kind of an abstract idea, though, so to do this part of my job, I ask a lot of operational questions, which essentially boil down to the same three themes. Do we have an objective or goal identified to execute in service of our mission? I ask what combinations of teams, people, projects, resources, that sort of thing, we need in order to reach our goal. And I ask probably the most important question, how do those entities exchange information in order to create change and generate value? And my bet is that you're part of some open source project or some organization where you probably ask yourself very similar questions. You ask things like, what are the big picture goals you want to reach, and what milestones might you need to create and hit in order to meet them? Maybe you're asking what some of the dependencies are that you'll need to manage, or major issues you'll need to close first, or what your code review process should look like, or how you might handle issue tracking or merging PRs. As our projects and goals get bigger, those operational questions get increasingly difficult to answer. Problems that were once really easy to solve on a small scale become exponentially more difficult and also a little bit more abstract. We start asking questions like, how do we get more collaborators on our projects? How do we get more users? How do we pay for servers? How do we allocate our time commitments to maybe work and then maybe also your open source project? How are you going to handle issues of IP or trademark infringement? As open source developers, we operate in a pretty complex system, and the fact that it's an open one doesn't necessarily make it any easier. This week at JSConf, we've talked mostly about the technical elements of software production systems, like the code, the architecture. But for the duration of this talk, when I'm referring to systems, I'll be focusing on the human element. And humanity is, again, kind of an abstract idea. So since this is a JavaScript conference, I decided to create an MVC framework for thinking about that kind of abstraction. If you're in a position with your project or company wherein you need to create a system for humans, remember MVC, which is mission, value, and change. It boils down to this simple philosophy, that every operator in the system, be it a person, a team, a project, a protocol, whatever, all of those things have the same job, to execute change that creates value in service of a mission. So let's take a look really quick at what that means. From NPM modules to Boku, each component in our open web system was created for some reason. There's some core objective or some problem it's trying to solve. An entity's mission doesn't really change over time. It's the impotence for change and not the change itself. Missions motivate, so in designing systems for humans, make sure you can identify the mission for every person, project, and team in your project or organization. Value can be a harder thing to nail down. Generally, when we think of value, we think of quantitative things, such as points scored in a game, or like dollars raised for cancer research. Quantitative values tend to be easier to measure and also name as milestones or metrics for success, like getting to version 1.0 or maybe getting 10,000 users. But for humans, you need a mix of quantitative and qualitative value in order to evaluate your system's success. Qualitative value is sort of like the intangible je ne sais quoi that you gain from an effort that you can't really pinpoint, but often relates to some new knowledge you gained or some subtle shift in opinion. You may not be quite sure how far it advances you toward your mission, but you do know that it at least moved forward. The components in our ecosystem don't exactly exist in a vacuum. They don't spontaneously become, they don't keep evolving on their own without some sort of process of change. If we think of the mission as an end we'd like to see brought about, change is the means we're executing toward that end. And sometimes it's big, and sometimes it's small, but either way, our system should always be changing. For the whole system to be effective, our components need to work together harmoniously, even as they're changing. But they also exist inside of cultural, political, and technical contexts, and those things can have real competing motivations sometimes. So it's nearly impossible for one system change not to impact others. It's hard to know where or when all of those changes are going to end up manifesting, like how a positive change on the technical spectrum might actually spark a negative change in the political. Our JavaScript community obviously cares very much about its direction and wants to see us move forward. Our projects are operating more transparently and collaboratively. Our companies and organizations are operating in a more socially responsible way. We're paying more attention now than ever before to how we address issues of diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. But complex systems like ours don't necessarily scale well, and they tend to fail far more consistently on the human element rather than the technical. I think we can simplify this. From open source engineer to open source C-suite, I think we all have the same job, which is to support the creation and exchange of value for the JavaScript community. I do this today at Boku through identifying and executing organizational change that ensures we're living our mission in everything we do. And today I'll try to do that a little bit by sharing what I've learned about organizational design as a means to help you create and scale your project or organization in whatever forward way suits your goals. Experience has taught me that if we give more thought to how we organize ourselves, we can do more for our projects and for the open web community. Using organizational design principles, we'll be better able to adapt to change, we'll be better able to communicate our mission, we'll be better able to exchange value with one another, and we'll be able to do all of this together in a more proactive and coordinated fashion. For those of you who are still not sure exactly why this matters, let's take a look at a case study because business people love case studies. This is from an article by Michael Rogers on the Node.js and Medium blog from earlier this month. He writes, in 2012, things were going really well. We had a thriving community, solid core contributions, and it was really clear that we were the fastest growing ecosystem in the world. So in 2012, Michael says, the system was pretty efficient. All of our cultural, technical, and political variables, all of the projects and people were operating harmoniously, and things were going good. The growth and change of the project ended up signaling a future imbalance of the system, though. Around this time, people noticed some concerns in the project with the ownership, and we end up seeing some people note that there's more value being created for the political spectrum than there is along the cultural or technical, and people in the system end up failing to act on that. When we cut to 2014, everybody agrees that there's a problem, but now the operators in our human system don't know how to change and change it. Growth and change in the system is slowing, it's becoming less efficient to the point that the project becomes forked, and now there's no clear way for them to generate value. If we cut to today, that system is being restored. Our Node and IO projects are both joining the Node Foundation with support from the Linux Foundation, and there are plans for these projects to reintegrate. That's all happening because a lot of people recognize the imbalance of the system and set to the very hard work of restoring it. They were organizing and designing systems through really formal channels like that of the Node Advisory Board, the IO Technical Committee, and a bunch of other informal channels like GitHub and IRC. They put in thousands of hours of work, had probably untold numbers of debates and arguments and so on and so forth, all of which to restore harmony in our human open web ecosystem. And so on behalf of Bocoup, I'd like to say thank you to those folks, including Chris, for doing that. Because it's really hard. The thing is, their problems are not unique. In another post on the Node blog, Michael Dolan, who is a director and attorney for the collaborative projects at Linux Foundation, said that they've found that the challenges of Node and I/O communities are not unique. Many of the open source projects that they have also struggle with the same challenges, and went on to list 5 key features of an open collaboration project. It's clear that the Node Foundation is going to be relying on and learning a lot from this, and there's lots of early indication that they're going to end up being very successful with this. But an open governance model doesn't necessarily guarantee success or growth. I think that's because openness as a sole ideal is really tricky to nail down. The rhetoric of openness is meant to communicate a favorable set of values, and those values often depend on the speaker and on the audience. In the absence of a single definition that suits all of those parties, we tend to take open to mean inclusive of everything. So if we want to be successful with our open collaboration projects, we're going to have to get more specific about our ideals and our values. Thoughtful organizational design helps us balance the fear of chaos and the fear of structure inherent in an open system so that the whole thing can move forward. It's a combination of abstract philosophy, like why we're even here and what's the meaning of life, that kind of philosophy, and concrete structures to help we humans do things together more effectively. Or perhaps put in terms of the MVC model of earlier, it helps us frame our decisions about change and value in terms of our mission. But I've certainly talked about abstractions long enough, so it's time to get a little bit more specific. Purpose is part of organizational design, and that's something that you supply for yourself and your projects. If you're doing a thing, you should probably know why you're doing it. If you're thinking about growing your project or organization, probably you should go through the process of discussing it and writing it down, write those purpose and values down with your core team so you all understand them and reread that together fairly regularly. This is going to help you keep that top of mind as you make decisions. And share it outside of your core team. Maybe put it on your website or your README. It will help you attract other users and collaborators who identify with your project, who maybe didn't understand it in the first place, but they connect with you on the purpose level. And that's really important. Governance is a more tangible idea than purpose. So as a result, we tend to solve problems using the realm of governance over the realm of purpose. Governance also means a lot of things. So as an idea, it can get really confusing. But generally speaking, governance structures provide the trellis upon which we can grow our purpose. And some of those structures include corporate form, decision-making structures, and decision enforcement structures. So what's corporate form? Corporate form is any group of persons treated by law as a single entity, having rights or liabilities that are distinct from the persons composing it. And it's very necessary for a lot of components in our system, including like the open source foundations, our standards bodies, our companies, and maybe even one day your project or your business. Corporate forms, things like C Corps, LLCs, they follow different rules and they have different rights depending also on the government under which they were incorporated and the governments under which they operate. And this starts to make a difference as your project scales. If you think you might want to take your project to a foundation or perhaps see it through some sort of official standardization process, definitely take a look at the corporate form of that entity first because it might end up making a difference. Decision-making structures, that's the who makes decisions and how they do it. In our open source world, this is generally all over the map. We have everything from like the, oh yeah, whatever, laissez-faire kind of decision-making that happens to some form of democratic process to maybe a benevolent dictatorship. Foundations and standards bodies, though, tend to operate a form of collaborative governance wherein all of those stakeholders are collectively empowered to make a decision through consensus, or as is the case with ECMA International that standardizes ECMAScript, to make recommendations to an appointed final decision body who does not substantially change consensus recommendations from the group. They are judicious in nature. Keep in mind that how you make decisions for your project will change over time depending largely on the stakeholders you have and also what those stakeholders value. As those people change, the values are going to change, and that's okay. If you think you'll move forward toward the nonprofit or standards track with your project, then plan now for your transition to a collaborative decision-making model, because that's actually a long and can be a tricky road. No matter how you make them, decisions don't really mean anything unless you have some means to enforce them, and those means are actually useful. There are proactive decision enforcement structures like testing suites and code review protocols and things like that, and they help reinforce a decision and mitigate risk before something happens. There are also reactive decision enforcement structures that reinforce decisions after exposure has already occurred, so after something has happened. And these are things like CLAs or codes of conduct. You'll need to consider your use of both forms depending on the risks you think you might be exposed to. And if you think a risk is really high, you're probably going to want to use more substantial forms of both in order to mitigate it. Successful systems can be attributed to the skill we exercise in designing them, which is all that governance stuff we were just talking about, and making those right governance choices in the first place, and also to the quality of the operations of that system. So here are a few principles for us to consider as you think about the operation of your human system. The first is simplicity. As we covered previously, complexity is not viral. Problems of process and communication multiply with each successive stage of complexity that you add. So when operating your organization, I like to say, don't play chess when you can play checkers. Be precise with your definitions and tasks. People like that. And don't try to build a system or set policies and things like that that solve 100% of your problems up front, but rather optimize your organization for one that throws good errors over one that throws bad errors. The second is flexibility. Organizations should have structure, but not be entirely rigid. Your organization should let people in it make adjustments based on new information from how they're operating it. That doesn't mean that you're letting them totally change the goals or objectives here, but rather letting them change how they're approaching that goal or objective based on the new data that they have. And remember that there are also many motivations for change, why they might be making a change in approach. And you may be tempted to only allow those changes that align with your own motivations, but organizations are not personal things. And they're going to operate at times with different motivations from yours. And that's also A-okay. That's actually good. The third principle here is reliability. Reliability. Any system is actually no more reliable than its weakest component. And reliability is maintaining consistency in your operations and also in your output of both the human sort and the technical sort. It essentially means that there should be no surprises for people in an organization or for the people who rely on it. Reliability is also as important for organizational growth as innovation. In software development, there can be some tension between reliability and innovation in a system. So you're going to want to plan up front for how you think about balancing that in your organization as you would on your project, how you think about balancing the stability and balancing the growth. Our fourth principle, which is probably one of the most important, is acceptability. Any organization, no matter how well designed it is not going to function properly unless it is accepted by the people who operate it. If participants don't believe that the organizational system is going to benefit them, if they are opposed to it, if they are pressured into using it, or if they think it's generally a bad system, it's not going to work as you intended, and two things are going to happen. Either it's going to be modified gradually over time by the people who are using it, which is good, but slow and arduous, or it will be used overall ineffectively and ultimately fail. So make sure you're getting clear buy-in from others in your organization, and pay close attention to resistance, any resistance that you feel. That organizational resistance and pushback is a human error message. Pay attention to it. If anything I've said today sounds familiar, it's probably because there is a lot of similar thinking when it comes to designing systems for software and designing systems for people. In both forms of system architecture, simplicity, reliability, and flexibility are frequently at tension with one another, and the general belief is that you really can only have two of the three at any given point. And if you've happened to figure out how to get all three in your system, I would really like to talk to you. In either case, remember that organizational design is the means and not the end. It's the framework through which we try and live our core values and qualities, and not how we try and measure our success. No matter what stage you're at in your project, it's really never too early to think about organizational design. Speaking of which, I think we can organize ourselves for a better open web community, and that we can and should start doing that right now. Because changes outside of our control are impacting us. There's a lot of external and environmental and market changes going on that we can't really control. Things like big projects merging. We have a lot of new software foundations forming, and old ones are changing as well. And companies are investing as never before in open source software. All this means that there's a lot of interest, attention, and money being paid to how organizations interact, intersect, and engage with open source projects. And we need to be able to communicate the vision we have for our community to these companies. I chose to speak today because I'm often asked how we do things at Bocoup. Those specifics don't necessarily apply to everyone here, so I chose to bring you all a framework we use to make those decisions. I think rising tides lift all boats, and I believe that we can help each other more efficiently and reliably using the tools of organizational design. I'm Jory Burson, and thank you very much for listening to me today. If I can help you in any way, please hit me up on Twitter or GitHub or IRC.